Thank you, everyone, and I must say thank you very, very much to the Basque government and to Tenica for coming here. It's difficult being towards the end of a fantastic conference because you are filled with reflections. I am anyway, and filled with thoughts that you want to take back and get out in action. So last night I was even pondering about what more can be said, because we have already learned so much. So saying this, I will try and take some pointers for work we have been doing over the last few years, both for the European Commission and in Denmark. But just a few points of reflection. We are hopefully right now at a stage where the crisis is lingering off, but we see a huge impact in terms of growing inequality. We see huge, not only unemployment, but underemployment all over the world. I just saw some data also from the United States that we have more and more people being in what you would call self-employment, not out of choice, but out of necessity. And I see in my own country there's sort of expectation, because the economy has been picking up in Denmark, that now we are getting back to business. But really, as far as we can see from all the studies we have conducted, it will not be business as usual. A lot of things have changed, and therefore it's also time maybe to think about the positioning of our vet systems. Let me tell you a little bit where I come from. I work in a center. I'm director for a Center for Policy and Business Analysis, a Danish technological institute. We were set up, we're an old lady, we were set up more than 100 years ago, notably to assist in technology diffusion to small and medium-sized enterprises, and also to support small and medium-sized enterprises in terms of working on the enabling framework conditions that can foster long-term growth and prosperity for companies. And my center is somewhat different than the rest of the institute, because we are hardcore technologies in many different areas, both in traditional sectors of industry, such as construction and textile, but also in new areas of pharmaceuticals, of plastics, going over in new ways of thinking about regeneration of building body pieces and whatnot. So a very exciting place to be. Right now, I'm personally engaged and very excited about work that's starting here in Europe with support to countries for review of their apprentice systems, together with CEDEFOP. And the work is, in fact, rolling right now. I have a colleague in Malta today for the kickoff. So lots of work going on, lots of opportunities, lot to learn from each other, I believe. Just a bit about the background of my discussion today. We have been working here in recent years a lot on global value chains and how SMEs can or do position themselves in global value chains. What we see at this stage is that big companies, multinationals, they concentrate the number of sub-suppliers, and it affects both manufacturing and services. For those companies that are the chosen ones, it's an immense opportunity to move up, to become part of development, to come out in new markets. But for those that are not in that position, it's another story. We just finished a study on state of affairs for the manufacturing industry in Europe for the European Parliament. And in Denmark, we did a major study looking at initiatives around and about the world which have been brought to scale, notably to support companies in their growth efforts. And this has led to a new, I think, very, very interesting, that's part of our new growth package that still has to be approved, but a program whereby which I would almost say for the first time in Denmark, we will target companies that do already have some strength to say, well, if we really stimulate them further, then they can be really kickstarting again also job growth in the economy, because without creation of jobs, we won't have demand. So we'll be working this program with a growth check, both at the operational level and at a strategic level, and naturally competences and the cooperation with education and training systems is very, very important part of that. Also, I would remind, we have not heard or talked so much about it here at this conference, but the OECD PIAC initiative measuring adults' competences is hugely important for our debates here, both in terms of digital technologies that we see across all sectors and the inequalities in terms of the abilities to exploit these technologies, because many people cannot solve simple problems in a digital environment. This is not about PC driver's license and more of that, but it's basic numeracy and literacy, but at a higher order level. Finally, there has been work going on in the European Commission, in DG EAC, on VET excellence and around VET and innovation, and I'll come back to that. European Central Bank recently released a survey on SMEs and their challenges in Europe. I think we would all automatically say that in some countries the biggest issue would be lack of finance and lack of development capital. But across all European countries, SMEs point to the very biggest challenge, that is lack of customer demand. We sit with saturated markets where it takes less human resources to produce a particular artifact. Brick economies that some SMEs even began to orientate themselves towards are not in a stable development situation as we saw some years ago. So how do companies, really, and small companies, begin to address emerging markets, for example in Africa, which will not be just a matter of taking some functionalities out of products, but really fundamentally understanding how can we translate challenge-based innovation into new types of products and artifacts that are sustainable because they can be maintained locally, because there's a skills base to begin also to develop these products themselves. So you think expansion of global value chains. That is a major, major issue right now, and I think it's interesting that both the European Commission, the OECD, the World Bank, World Economic Forum begin to look at the opportunities of inclusive innovation as a driver of long-term growth, but it'll have enormous consequences also in terms of how we think our VET policies. What strikes me also, and of course, it is important to raise a qualification base. We cannot disagree about that. But we certainly also see now, more than ever, I think, the limitations of skills supplies policies in the sense that, and we heard the previous speaker showing the differences between innovation leaders and innovation laggards. There's a very strong correlation between low innovation performance, low demand for skills, poor work organization practices, no job creation. So if we really need to rebalance policies also and think about how can we stimulate that demand in companies for better skills utilization, because for the individual, it's a major risk if they come in such a company because they don't develop. For our economy as such, it's a major risk because we invest in skills and they are not utilized, so they deteriorate over time. I do think that VET systems and VET institutions can play a major role in balancing this skills demand, skills supply equation, but it requires more specialization. And it also requires that we do not talk so much about skills needs and skills issues with companies. Companies don't have a skills issue. Companies have a business problem. And sometimes a skill can be the answer, sometimes it's something else, and sometimes it's combinations. I think the VET systems also can play a huge role because, in fact, one of the problems in Europe is that the whole market for SME support is, in fact, not a market, but very, very ad hoc, project-based, so there's not a long-term way of really thinking about how can we develop services that actually make a difference. So first point is really to think about the role of VET in economic development and innovation. In that context, I think that what has been achieved here in the Basque Country is very interesting. For example, what the role that Technica has, because they also really think about the training of trainers models. It's not just a question of pedagogics that we tend to say a lot in my country. No, they also think pedagogics and technology diffusion as an integrated model. You see the same for the community colleges in the United States, which are recognized players in economic development. When we did the study on VET innovation, or the role of VET in innovation for the European Commission, it was quite surprising because we made a survey to economic development agencies, to cluster bodies and whatnot. Apart from the applied sciences institutions, they don't see VET as a player in economic development. And that's a challenge. That is something that has to be worked on, not just at the institutional level, it also requires policy coordination locally, regionally, nationally, at EU level. And therefore it's great to hear also with the SME, with the Act on SMEs, that skills will be a more important debate. Likewise, we see the unrecognized role of the skilled worker in innovation in SMEs. The way, because we've been doing, the last 2 years, we have been doing about 300 case studies round and about in Europe, being out in the shop floor, not just interviewing, but also observing what does the skilled worker actually do. And the interesting thing is that they really innovate by doing and by interacting and by using materials and by using processes. That's a particular strength. We used in manufacturing to see manufacturing, for example, very much as a cost. I begin to see a development where the shop floor is actually seen as a source of innovation, and that positions the skilled worker very strongly, and also the VET system very, very strongly. Let me give you a small story about a company in Denmark that won a big contract for producing very advanced hospital beds to a country, foreign country. And the television came because it was really a huge contract. And let us see your R&D department. And the director of the company, it's a company of 30 people, said, come over here. And then he pointed, this is the shop floor, this is my skilled workers. They are the ones who actually developed, understood what the next generation of intelligent beds would be like in a hospital, because they had worked so closely with customers in the hospital sector before, so they really, really knew what the issues were about. So this type of innovation is very, very important. That can be designed so it can be supported. So VET excellence, that raises the issue. As important permeability to higher levels of vocational education, permeability between vocational and higher education is, then VET excellence also has to be thought about practice, excellence in practice. We don't want everybody to educate out of the VET system. In Denmark already we have a huge problem in manufacturing because we don't have enough skilled workers. So what constitutes excellence if that is to drive innovation in a more profound way? I'll come back to that. The big policy question for me really in two directions we see in companies right now is, on one hand, the uptake of advanced technologies leading to a greater standardization, modularization, to a degree in some companies that lead to high levels of efficiency, but also what some English researchers have called digital Taylorism. Very narrow, well-defined jobs, except for these selected few, but highly efficient companies that can compete globally. On the other hand, we have done some studies on in Denmark, because there's been a lot of interest in the German Mittelstand. Is that a unique German phenomenon or what? And no, it isn't. We have the same similar type of small family-owned businesses that are global niche players. They are as profitable as the German companies. Their strength is really their shop floor workers and seeing the shop floor as a space for innovation. You can find the same in services. You can find the same also in public health. It's really the matter of rethinking the role of the frontline worker. So, efficient skills policies, we must address skills utilization. Examples of that, I think, Tanika from here, in Australia, the skills ecosystems, where in traditional sectors, they, by networking companies, by working with company leaders, try to build their capacity, making the case that skills utilization also improves productivity. We see it in the United States with the community colleges and the role they play, also with our technology demo centers, giving an opportunity to get first-hand on, see what it is, but also learning through action that, in fact, investments in automation and digital technologies will cost on productivity if it's not followed up by rearranging workflow practices, by upskilling, by thinking business processes the whole way through. So vet systems here in Europe, and linked again to the apprentice systems and continuing training, can they move from training providers to integrated service providers to SMEs? I do think so, and I think, for example, in the structural funds, there are lots and lots of opportunities to carry that development further. At present, we have a lot of programs that are aimed at enhancing the skills of the future workforce, but few programs that link work organization, job redesign, technology utilization. Finland had a program some years ago that I really think could act as a model program, which was also taken to scale, the Tykes initiative. So basically, my argument is that innovation is about orchestrating learning processes. It's about doing, but reflective doing, so it's linking hands and head when you talk about incremental innovation and innovation from the shop floor. We have seen in Europe that we have invested massively, and the Horizon 2020 now is an example of realizing that, yes, we have invested massively in R&D, but we haven't had sufficient advantage in terms of lifting the overall innovation capacity. Whereas we also see other models living parallel to this universe of user and employee-driven innovation, and to a very large extent, that is driven by employees that collaborate, employees that have time to reflect, employees that can learn and experiment. In principle, companies in Europe or all over the world, I think, have gone through so many hardcore lean processes, so this space for reflection and learning from experimentation is very, very limited now. So that again sets some new challenges to vet systems. How can they, in apprentice-based system, create that linkage between work-placed and work-based learning, so that space for reflection, that space for experimentation is linked to practice. I talked a little bit about PIAC before. In Denmark, we have the OECD PIAC study showed that we have about 1 million Danes between 16 and 65 years old who cannot solve basic problems in an ICT environment. That's enormous for a country with in total 5.5 million. Because the shop floor, almost regardless of what sector you talk about, is so technology rich now, how do we actually integrate this form of higher order numeracy and literacy, which is really required to work effectively and to work innovatively around the technologies. In a sense, and I think when we visited the various centers here, when we have been in the Basque Country, we've certainly seen where there used to be a direct interface between machines and materials, the computer is now the interface. And that sets huge requirements in terms of literacy and numeracy to navigate in this universe. And it doesn't help really to have PC lessons or ICT lessons apart, and it doesn't help to have literacy or numeracy courses apart. It has to be integrated in that working environment. So can we, in our pedagogics, move closer, whether we have more school-based or we have apprentice systems, can we, in a space, emulate work environments so we, in action, get opportunities to gradually build up these skills? And I believe so, and I've seen it. But it really takes rethinking learning and teaching. Some years ago, we did a study on new skills for new jobs, comparative study between United States and Europe. It was surprising how many were talking about soft skills and the importance of soft skills to employability and to navigating in a modern workplace. Yet, very, very few had changed their educational practices in any kind of way. It's a little bit like when I learned to swim when I was a kid. We first had to swim many lessons on the ground with belts and everything before we were thrown in the water. And there's some things you don't learn unless you're out in the water. So skills utilization can be part of the wider business support structure. It requires cooperation within innovation systems, depending upon how regional, national innovation systems look like. There's space for improvement, certainly there, both for the horizontal and the vertical cooperation. One of the ways of building capacity for better skills utilization is certainly also to regrouping firms and working with firms around the strategic planning. Those vet institutions that do well do precisely that. They have also specialized to a higher degree to do so. You cannot be good to everyone and then have sufficient capacity to really bring value added to businesses. Those institutions that do it well have very much focus on value chains. We still don't understand value chains very well in terms of implications for policy making. But what we can see from those areas where the value chain has been a concept also used around skills, skills demand, skills supply, it does lead to larger scale value chain upgrading. Duke University in particular from the United States has done some really interesting work in that respect. Workplace learning, apprenticeship. One of the things that strikes me, having been in the field and started myself in the vet system many years ago, is how learning outcomes and competency-based language has really driven the dialogue between schools and vet systems. It's much easier to understand what it is all about, who should do what, when you talk about learning outcomes and competences rather than curriculum. What is also necessary in that construct is to think about how can learning at the school and learning at the workplace be integrated. Some of the tools, as simple as digital learning portfolio, can really be a means that the learner himself, herself, can be a carrier and a linkage between those two spaces. What is important, and what I've certainly seen in my own country where we have an apprentice system, is in that it's extremely important if we want to scale the apprentice systems to really give support to companies. It's all the contractual business, but certainly also adapting when does the school-placed training take place, when are they in the company, and so forth, to create that flexibility and to ensure that the apprentice really get in the dual role of both having the status as an employee, but also as a learner. This model is adapted from something I learned from Singapore, in fact, but it's a model that I think we can develop much further in the VET system. Many places we have implemented project-based learning, but it's project-based learning as if, why not projects that are authentic? In so many companies, they have ideas for projects where they don't have the resources to realize them for one reason or another. These projects offer a rich opportunity for learning, and I've seen several schools, in fact, using that authentic-based learning with an integrated curriculum as a first step. What is important that you often cannot get to do at in a company, that is experimenting, posing the questions, trying different solutions before you go in the final solution mode. Digital technology is now with design and with rapid prototyping and so forth, offer immense opportunities to try out solutions, emulating what happens in the shop floor when you innovate in open models with the customers. I've seen also that learners which have difficulties maybe with abstract terminology around creativity and innovation, creating artifacts, designing artifacts to a real world, to a real solution, suddenly things begin to fall in place, what is meant by being really a talented, skilled worker. So that circle can be implemented to a much greater degree in our vocational education system. And that's really where I think we should go at if that is going to be a part in innovation. So real-world relevance is one criteria. Working on ill-defined problems. Problems out in the real world are not nice and neat and easy to handle. No, many of them are complex and requires occupational capacities that cross boundaries. It's the issue of design thinking. It doesn't help that I create the best pump in the whole world, the most advanced pump, if there's nobody to repair it afterwards in the country I sell it to. So design thinking, working with real emulated customers if they are not there, that's also a way of really learning these higher order skills that can be so difficult to acquire in a normal class construct. And then finally, not forgetting the role of digital resources. For those of you who do not come from Europe, it's worthwhile pointing to the European Commission's opening education communication, which on one hand realized that with ICTs, we have gotten to the electronic classroom or putting electricity behind the classroom, but this opening of education and really fundamentally rethinking learning, we haven't succeeded so far, but numerous steps are being taken now at Europe level to create these new learning spaces. So this is what it could look like. Students actually working maybe also across borders through Erasmus Plus with schools from other parts of the world around authentic challenges. It can be water, it can be health, it can be sustainable food production, where they get opportunities to create artifacts in groups where they work across occupations, where they use external networks, OER materials, and so forth to actually create artifacts that can work, and as a step also to inclusive innovation, to assisting companies in acting in a more global way. I think and hope it's possible, and I really believe we have to because the whole issue with no demand that SMEs experience as such a big problem, that is not solved by more marketing. It's solved by fundamentally rethinking what business is about and what it could be. Thanks for now, and thanks for inviting me.